Tragic news from Israel. The IDF confirms 31 hostages taken by Hamas are dead. Israeli intelligence is also investigating reports that another 20 hostages may have been killed.
Well, negotiations for the release of those remaining in captivity are moving forward with a new deal that's being described as achievable. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari said the IDF notified 31 hostage families that their loved ones are no longer alive. The New York Times also reporting that Israeli intelligence is assessing unconfirmed information that at least another 20 hostages may also have been killed. The report said some of the dead were killed on October 7th, some died of injuries while in captivity, and others were killed by Hamas inside Gaza. Alongside the shocking news comes word of potential progress in hostage negotiations. Qatar's prime minister said Hamas is positive about the latest proposed deal, which would include a pause in the fighting and release of Palestinian prisoners. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said a deal is achievable, but there's a lot of work to be done. In Paris Wednesday, families of French-Israeli hostages appealed for their release.
We don't need people to hope for us. I have hope. We need help to get citizens free from the captivity of Hamas. Oad is a French citizen, and I ask from France to do all the effort to release him and everyone.
Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz reaffirmed securing release of the hostages is one of the main goals of the war.
The return of the kidnapped is an integral part of the victory and does not replace our duty to remove the threat of Hamas. If we reach an outline, it will be a step on the way to victory.
The IDF also announced it's found evidence in tunnels under Khan Yunis linking Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar to Iran.
We're publishing some of the intelligence information found by our forces indicating a direct connection from Iran to Hamas and more so to Yahya Sinwar.
The IDF discovered large amounts of cash, documents showing the transfer of funds from Iran to Hamas, and envelopes of cash transferred directly to Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. In all, they seized 20 million shekels and documentation that Iran transferred more than $150 million to Hamas and Sinwar in the last decade. Meanwhile, in a show of support to the Jewish state, newly elected Argentinian President Javier Milei arrived in Israel, prayed at the Western Wall, and announced his plans to move his country's embassy to Jerusalem. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, it's absolutely horrible news to learn that the hostages have been killed. And let's continue to have hope for those that remain and hope that they are alive and hope that they can be released. Qatar is the place where to put pressure. They've been harboring Hamas leadership in a luxury hotel for a long time. They've been supplying Hamas with money for a long time. The amount of money coming from them makes some of the international community amounts seem small. Let's put pressure on them. The U.S. has a military base. There's a reason Prime Minister Netanyahu was angry that the U.S. wasn't applying pressure and signed a new lease for that military base with Qatar and didn't require them to do anything about Hamas. We need to stop this ideology and especially need to stop funding it so they can't build terror tunnels and rockets and outfit terrorists to come and attack innocent civilians. This has to end. And 18 nations have now suspended funding for UNRWA over allegations that its workers participated in the October 7th attacks. For decades, the UN agency has been accused of using international aid to fuel hatred against the Jewish state. Now, Israel wants it defunded for good. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
Things must change, and it starts with UNRWA.
Knesset member Sharon Haskell created the caucus to reform UNRWA 9 years ago.
UNRWA is an organization of the United Nations that is a complete cover-up for Hamas activities. They are inciting and educating children to violence and hatred.
In caring for so-called Palestinian refugees living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, as well as nearby countries, UNRWA's website says its services include primary and vocational education, primary health care, relief and social services, and camp improvement.
We need to understand that UNRWA is not an organization that provides education and welfare and health care. That's merely the facade. It's an organization that has two deep roles: to ensure that the conflict from 1948 remains an open case, and therefore that there is a permanent question mark on Israel's very existence, creating a generation after generation of Palestinians who believe that one day Israel will not exist.
Dr. Anat Wilf adds, UNRWA relieves Hamas of any humanitarian responsibility, a philosophy confirmed by senior Hamas member Musa Abu Marzouk, who said, these tunnels are meant to protect Hamas from Israeli planes, and it's the responsibility of the UN to protect the people.
There's a generation that does not know that UNRWA was started in order to undermine the state of Israel. Count Falk Bernadette, who was the first UN mediator, he was upset with the the law of return.
That law allows Jews worldwide to immigrate to Israel.
So he said, well, the Palestinians have to have the right of return, and their inalienable right to go back to where they came from in '48, instead of being, absorbed like any other refugee.
David Bedin started Israel Behind the News to expose teachings and practices going on inside UN facilities in Gaza and the West Bank.
We have been through 1,000 school books used by the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA. We were offered by a prominent rabbi $10,000 for a research grant to find anything for peace. I said, look, I'd like to have your money, but it doesn't exist. It is one system, not for hatred, but for murder.
Knesset member Simcha Rotman says UNRWA funding needs to stop.
So the fact that UNRWA gets money as a donation, and this money supports terror, actively supports terror, needs to stop. There is no excuse for educating for terror. There is no excuse for facilitating the next October 7th.
Wilf says, unfortunately, Israel cooperated with UNRWA for years, thinking it was a moderating force.
Israel has to do a 180 and declare quite clearly that it will no longer cooperate with UNRWA. UNRWA provides no benefit, and no country that is a friend of Israel should give any money to UNRWA.
The United Nations is a hornet's nest of Jew hatred, is a hornet's nest of deception, is a hornet's nest of terror-supporting policies and organizations.
Dan Diker of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs says Gaza has become a forward base for the Iranian regime.
Today, it's the Iranian regime that is mobilizing UNRWA with its Hamas proxy to incite to the murdering of Jews and Israelis, to carry out acts of terror. They have sanctified as a strategic objective the destruction of Israel from within UNRWA compounds and organizations within Gaza.
Diker believes the U.S. should lead an international body to supervise UNRWA donations until it can be dissolved and responsibility given to local Palestinians. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
We've been calling for defunding this agency. It's the UN Relief Works Agency. It's unique. It's unique in history, the history of the UN, unique in international politics and international law. It's designed to provide ongoing relief for refugees from the 1948 war. What happened in 1948, Israel declared independence, was recognized by the UN, and on the day they did that, the Arab nations around them declared war. And they asked the Arab residents of Israel to move out of the way. They didn't want them to be collateral damage, casualties because of the war. And so they all evacuated. Now, the UN has been supplying them in refugee camps now for over 75 years. It has to stop. We've been saying it for years that they're educating children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren now in hatred against Israel. And they get them indoctrinated that from the river to the sea, where Palestine will be free. We want to wipe Israel off the map, and they want to kill every Jew in Israel. This should never be funded by U.S. money. Now, Congress can act. What happened in the past two administrations under President Trump UNRWA was not funded. It was defunded. And he wanted it to be permanent, but he couldn't get there. The Biden administration, literally within the first few days of the new administration, reinstated the funding. Now we have solid evidence that employees of a UN agency were part of the terrorists who attacked southern Israel. It's inconceivable that U.S. tax dollars would fund a terrorist organization. But it's not just UNRWA, it's funding going directly to Hamas. It has to stop. We shouldn't do this. So what can happen, and how can you block the State Department? How can you block future administrations from reinstating this funding? Right now, the Biden administration says we're suspending funding. Well, it needs to stop, and it needs to stop permanently. Please encourage your congressman, your representative, your senator to pass a bill saying no more funding. The U.S. Congress has the authority here. They can do that, and I would urge they should do it, and should do it as soon as possible.